Israel's peaceful, friendly neighbor to the southwest, has shown its friendliness again today in an incident on the Rafah border when Egyptian soldiers fired at Israeli soldiers. Now, what's behind that? Is it actually the Egyptian government deciding to attack Israel? Highly unlikely, although I wouldn't put that entirely past them, even if they wouldn't admit it. It could be soldiers deciding that to take matters into their own hands. But the fact of the matter is, this wasn't some lone crazy gunman. This was several soldiers on the Egyptian side choosing to shoot at Israeli military. Several one Egyptian soldier died, several were injured. It's what's important here in this context. This might cause some sort of an incident. I don't think it'll be a major incident, but yeah, Piotr says in the chat actually exactly what I think. That's how peace with Arabs look like. Yeah, that's the idea of peace with any of Israel's Arab neighbors has always been problematic in my view, and I think we see that whenever they comment on anything that those countries that Israel have peace with comment on anything that Israel does, you see how peaceful and how they're allies of Israel. But specifically with Gaza, when people talk about what's going to happen in Gaza after Israel gets rid of Hamas, which I think is already an optimistic way of putting it, many say, well, what should be done is some force of friendly Arab countries, and Egypt is mentioned as one of those. And even if the official position of the governments who send those soldiers would be, don't indoctrinate people to terrorism or don't allow that to happen, those will be the soldiers on the ground, the same soldiers who shot today, or soldiers who didn't shoot but would like to, or who agree with that. That's something that, I'm sure this incident, the meaning of it will be ignored by Israel, but it won't be ignored by us. Welcome to the Daily Objective, day 234, I believe, of the war in Israel. Daniel, your thoughts on this incident that happened today?
So, just to put some context, yesterday we talked about the rockets coming from Rafah into Israel. So that happened. Today there have been rockets coming also from, I think, like over 30 rockets coming from South Lebanon, again to Israel. Something else that happened yesterday, there was actually an airstrike in southern Gaza by Israel that targeted two senior Hamas officials who were actually killed, but reportedly also civilians were killed as well, which again received Israel an international condemnation, also from Egypt. So this incident comes while Egypt is has internationally condemned Israel just yesterday, and as well as many attacks have came to Israel both yesterday and today. So I think, however, so we don't know fully well what there are talks between Israel and Cairo, Egypt. The incident is still being discussed. It's hard to say. I cannot imagine if this was like an actual policy from Egypt, telling them soldiers to try something or see what you can do. Apparently, they were in the area, I think, looking into basically what happened with the airstrikes. So at least from that, it seems like they, if just the fact that those, IDF and the Egyptian army that even met, it seems like the fault is already on the Egyptian side. But again, we'll know more information later. But yeah, just the fact that this comes while there is a condemnation, while, Egypt has this relationship with Israel. I mean, if this was like an actual this would be an actual declaration of war if it actually came like an official thing. So I don't think Israel should treat this incident lightly. But again, just for a start, I think this is what I have to say.
Yeah. If it was from higher ups, then it is an act of war, and I mean it's an act of war anyway. But if it would be a declaration of war, and we've seen how Israel responds to actual acts of war, and it's not impressive. And the problem here, the wider problem here, is Israel's continued delusion and intentionally lying to itself about who Israel's friends are and to what extent their friends can be trusted as proper allies. Um, the Egypt is obviously not a friend, obviously not an ally. They joined South Africa's claim of what was it? Was it the genocide claim or the stop the Rafah
I think
operation?
it was the Rafah.
Yeah. So th those are not allies. But Israel also needs to look at how their actual allies look at Israel's weakness. And so yesterday there was an operation in Rafah. There was a bombing in Rafah of some terrorists, a successful bombing that killed the terrorists. It was a proper act in a war, and some civilians died. And this is what people remember from yesterday. They don't remember the rockets on Tel Aviv where no civilians died because they're not as accurate. Whereas in Israel, they accurately they managed to hit the terrorists, and the terrorists, of course, among the Palestinians, always make sure there are civilians around because that films well, and they know the response they're going to get. And the U.S. has issued some statement about the scenes, heartbreaking scenes from Rafah, about of innocent civilians dying, and these are Israel's allies, and Israel doesn't actually say, "Look, we did the right thing here." And the civilians, if civilians die, that is Hamas's fault. And to a certain extent, it's the fault of the civilians who refuse to get rid of Hamas. They should know you can get rid of Hamas, and you're in no danger of Israeli airstrikes. You are in danger of Israeli airstrikes because a war is being fought in your name, and you're doing nothing to say, no, this is not in my name. You're doing everything so far to say it is in your name. And so, yeah, civilians will die in a war where the civilians are behind it, are supporting it, and the enemy is using them with apparently their consent as human shields. But yeah, in the wider picture of this, I think every such incident that happens is a moment where I always say, maybe Israel now will react differently, and unfortunately, they always do the wrong thing, and the world listens and sees the weakness and sees an opportunity in Israel's weakness.
Yeah, something I'm hoping will happen at some point is that Israel will realize that nothing they will do will be good enough for the other nations, the nations around them. I mean, like you said, yesterday there were rockets coming to Tel Aviv, and yeah, have we heard any international condemnation of Hamas? Have we heard anything, some condemnation of Hamas? No, what we heard is actually the defense of Hamas. They're being oppressed. Even in our chat, we've heard it. The oppressed have a right to resist. And yeah, so the fact that Israel, again, I think they allowed more than 500,000 of people to get out of Rafah. They are, again, conducting, I think I would have to go back what my predictions were. I think I probably have predicted that they wouldn't even go to Rafah. So the fact that we are even in Rafah is pretty surprising for me. But again, it's done the slowest and the most safest way for civilians. that they can do. I mean, IDF is actually, I believe, pulling out some troops from the area, basically to what's the word, to comply with the International Court of Justice to some extent. So they are doing all the steps they can to basically try to comply with the demands of the international community while still trying to defend themselves. But again, it's never going to be good enough. And one thing I forgot to mention that happened yesterday is also yesterday on Sunday, Egypt actually resumed aid deliveries into Gaza via the Kirim Shalom crossing. And again, this is aid for the enemies. This is like an actual aid that will go to Hamas unless it is in the areas controlled by IDF. That's the only time where the Hamas doesn't get to get their hands on. But whatever aid goes into areas that are not controlled by IDF will go to Hamas largely. And again, this is support for the war and support for the Hamas war effort. And even if some aid doesn't go to Hamas and goes to the Palestinians, again, this is the people who do support this war, who do still largely support Hamas and what happened on October 7th. They participated in it, they celebrated in it, and if Israel doesn't finish this war fully, and Hamas will be able to stay in power, or maybe if the response again is not strong enough, and maybe Hamas gets removed, but the people themselves will stay, they will just create another organization such as Hamas and will continue with another October 7th. So again, Israel cannot, if Israel wants to have a future which is peaceful, it has to do the war correctly. You cannot expect again to have this like such a weak response to an act of terrorism, well, not even an act of terrorism, like an actual declaration of war from Hamas, and expect again that just some response and some killing of Hamas leaders will be enough to convince the Palestinian people that trying to genocide Jews is not a good policy if you want to live
Yeah, thank you, Bonnie, for the super chat. And Bonnie, thank you also for yesterday's super chat, which didn't show up, and then it showed up somewhere, but I didn't read it. Bonnie said yesterday, thank you for doing this for 233 consecutive days. Thank you. And also, Bonnie said today in the chat, ABC News called Hamas's rockets at Tel Aviv Hamas resilience. So I didn't see that, but I was thinking about that because I think I saw it elsewhere, people on Twitter saying, look how resilient they are. They're still fighting. And that's something that Israel needs to remember, because Israel is fighting this war, even when they're fighting it militarily, they're fighting it more diplomatically than militarily with the military itself. So you mentioned Israel allowing people out of Rafah. Well, they've done that from the start. They told people where they're going to bomb. So the north of the Gaza Strip, people were encouraged to leave, and they did that wherever they went. And when you do that, inevitably terrorists will get away. So the north of Gaza was people left. It was bombed. Empty buildings were bombed, many of them. And now in the north, there are incidents every day. There are soldiers being killed by terrorists because the terrorists are still alive. The buildings are not in as good condition, but buildings don't shoot people. And they do that now in the south and in Rafah. And when you hear the way it's reported, and certainly the commentary on it, certainly here in the UK, you hear that this is a bad thing, that Israel is moving the population, people are being told to move from place to place. poor people. How can you do this to them? And so even when Israel does these things that I, again, don't think they should do, to help civilians, to help protect civilians, civilians can protect themselves by getting rid of Hamas. If they don't want to, they're fair game. But unfortunately, Israel, yeah, as you mentioned, goes out of its way. It's seen in the world as something completely irrelevant in the face of the images that Palestinians share on social media. But it's seen in the Arab world, and specifically among the Palestinians, as proof that Israel doesn't have what it takes, and that's true. Morally, Israel doesn't have what it takes to win this war. Militarily, it does, but morally, it chooses to let the enemy live and get away with October 7th and get away with taking hostages. And this incident with the Egyptian army, I'm sure in some way, part of the problem here now is that an Egyptian soldier died, several were injured, and no Israelis were injured. So if diplomatically, Israel is now begging for forgiveness, I'm sure, in back channels from Egypt because they won this incident that Egypt chose to start instead of sending a very clear message. This happens again. One bullet is fired again from Egypt towards Israelis. That is an act of war. Egypt is an enemy, and we will take you out. But of course, Hamas did a lot more than one bullet, and they still haven't been taken out again by Israel's choice.
Yeah, and again, you have to realize, even if it was, some sort of like solo action by those soldiers, by a company of those soldiers or whatever it was, again, if Egypt doesn't have a control of their army enough that, random rogue soldiers will just go into Israel and attack IDF soldiers, that is still a fault of the Egypt. They cannot like evade the responsibility that, just because we didn't okay it doesn't mean that this didn't happen or that it's okay. So someone in the chat said, get the United Nations police to restore order. Israel doesn't have any business being in Gaza. And so we had an episode when we talk about I think the 6-Day War, or the actions that led to the 6-Day War, or a couple of years what happened before. So there was the UN peacekeeping force in Egypt. I'm trying to, because that was after, So there was the UN peacekeeping force because there was a war before, there was the Suez War before that. So there was a UN peacekeeping force between Egypt and Israel. And we have those things happening all over the world. We have the similar thing in Cyprus, which seemingly seems like it's working. And when I was reading about this conflict, I was like, okay, maybe this is actually a place for UN. You send UN soldiers and you have this sort of like international, international recognition. And so what they did is they just dismissed them and they went away. Nothing happened. So they didn't. This actually doesn't solve anything. So even if you had, well, something to mention, you have UN in the Gaza, you have the UNRWA in Gaza, and what happened? They, in many cases, they directly participate with Hamas. They directly work with Hamas. On October 7th, there was the UNRWA tunnel, or the tunnel. Well, I mean, there's so many points, but the most recently there was the hostages were held in UNRWA building. UNRWA vehicles were being used by Hamas. Again, looking into UN as this sort of, international coalition that will bring peace to the world looks nice on paper, but whenever you actually look into what happens, it's a terrible thing. And to think that if only UN takes over Gaza, it would solve this problem. Again, it never does. Like I said, just look at UNRWA. They directly participated in October 7, both, like I said, militarily, such as holding hostages, but also by education. The main reason why this conflict keeps going on is because the Palestinian children are being taught that they should hate Jews, are being taught that the only way that the Palestinians will be free is when Palestine will be from the river to the sea.
Yeah, well, I don't know why a peacekeeping UN peacekeeping force with the Egyptian-Israeli border sounded like a good idea to you. We talk about the UN a lot in the context of Israel, and we talk mostly, especially since October 7th, about UNRWA and about voting in the General Assembly and in the the Security Council. We don't talk about the different things that the UN does, but wherever they do something, it's usually harmful. Like there was, child abuse scandals and all sorts of things going on with UN peacekeeping forces elsewhere. By the way, I think there's a peacekeeping force on the Lebanese-Israeli border as well, right? UNIFIL. We know how great a job they're doing. They in the past have been accused, let's say, of aiding Hezbollah. And it would make sense because they couldn't operate in the south of Lebanon if they weren't at least approved by Hezbollah, because Hezbollah, controls things there, and Hezbollah is, in Lebanon, which is a member state of the United Nations, but Hezbollah itself is not, and they allow themselves liberties, if you want to use that word, that others don't. So yeah, the idea of a UN peacekeeping force is not a good idea. I mean, the best peacekeeping force is a strong military that the country is ready to use. And if Israel has the first part of that, they just don't have the willingness to use it. And if they show willingness to use it, the result will be peace eventually. And if they show weakness, well, we already see what weakness has brought. Weakness has brought more terrorist attacks, has brought Hezbollah attacks being a daily occurrence, has brought the first ever Iranian attack on Israel, and has brought some Egyptian soldiers to the point where they think, you know what? We don't need our government to declare war. We can just go for it. Who's going to do anything? And they were right. Thank you, Garbled Words, for the super chat. Garbled Words says, thank you for your tireless effort to speak up for truth, morality, and pointing out the hypocrisy. Thank you for that. Thank you, PC, for the super chat. PC says, will this end the 45 years of peace with Egypt? Scary. I wouldn't be scared of that because it's not a real peace. I mean, I don't think it was a good idea in the first place. And the problem with that peace is, first of all, my view is that free countries should not have any diplomatic relations with dictatorships as a general rule. So I don't think we should have these agreements. We shouldn't acknowledge any gang that takes over a country as the legitimate government of that country, which is what you do when you have diplomatic relations with them. But furthermore, I think in that case, if you want to have some sort of agreement, a more significant than an armistice, ceasefire agreement or whatever. What Israel should absolutely not have done is given back the Sinai Desert, because that's a part of it. Like Israel pays with territory and whatever else, and in exchange gets peace. The point should have been, Egypt, you are better off having peace or some sort of non-war situation than going to war. If war happens, you will be worse off, and we're not going to pay you off for your peace. This peace, as you can see it right now, looks like a bought peace that doesn't mean anything and isn't the worth the paper it's signed on.
Yeah, I mean, if we learned anything from the Six-Day War, is the only way for Israel to conduct with these nations is to attack preemptively and attack strongly. Maybe IDF should, like, every 5 years just routinely bomb every single airport in Egypt. I mean, obviously joking, but yeah, again, like any sort of peace with these nations has never led to an actual peace. It's always a ceasefire until those nations think they are strong enough to again attack Israel. It doesn't matter if it's the actual nations such as Egypt or Lebanon, or terrorist organizations such as Hezbollah, or Hamas, or even the more moderate Palestinian Authority. Uh, I mean, yeah, what else to say? I mean, the only way, again, and we keep repeating ourselves, the only way that the Palestinians will respond to an Israeli action is a military action. They will never respond to peace, because the only reason why they even ever try to negotiate is because it always benefits them and it never benefits Israel.
Nastasia says in the chat, why didn't the Lebanese chief judge on the ICJ recuse himself? Well, that question only makes sense if you take the J in ICJ seriously. I know that they have the word justice in it, but they are, they care about justice as much as your run-of-the-mill social justice warrior. People still use that term. Anybody who claims to be in favor of social justice cares about justice. Yeah. This is not a court of justice. This is a court of injustice. It's a court that only tries and only looks at those who will actually participate in that court. And we know that Hamas won't. So yeah, I think I think the people who should recuse themselves are free countries who should say we're not able to participate because we actually want justice.
Yeah, I mean, one thing when you think about the ICJ and the composition of the court, there's actual Slovak justice there, so that's all that you need to realize how independent or how pro-justice those people are.
Yeah, thank you, PC, for the super chat. PC says the Copts are the natives of Egypt occupied land. Yeah, I mean, look, people can people. I'm not a huge fan of this saying, well, look at all this other occupied, because a problem with the hypocrisy argument is that you accept the other side being right. You're just saying that they're doing being right on what they're claiming is right and wrong, but they're actually doing what is wrong. So there's definitely hypocrisy there, and there's hypocrisy in all the attacks on Israel. Of course, when supporters of Hamas or of the Palestinians use the word free or use the word rights, that it's ridiculous, because they're against freedom and they're against rights, and that's what they're fighting against. But yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah.
again, who was there before is never the point. I mean, virtually all land everywhere has been conquered by several groups, ethnicities, whatever we want to call them, at different times. The only thing that matters for a legitimacy of a government is how much do they protect individual rights. If, let's say, the Arabs or Muslims, after the Golden Age, didn't revert back to savagery and continued to flourish, and they had their own John Muhammad al-Locke, who developed the idea of rights, and Middle East would be this, Western civilization would be actually in the Middle East. Yeah, those countries would be legitimate, and every other nation that would be against it would not be. So again, who was there before is never the point. It's, do they protect individual rights? And if not, those countries are not legitimate.
Speaking of people who claim to protect individual or want to protect individual rights, but for the most part are not legitimate, the Libertarian Party at their convention, they hosted John Kennedy Jr., not John, Robert Kennedy Jr. They hosted Donald Trump. They not junior, the senior. And yeah, that was interesting to say the least. Interesting enough that is the topic of today's episode of the reality show, and it's the first, I think the first, not the first episode where we're talking about the U.S. elections, but it is kind of the kickoff, I think, to our more extensive coverage of the U.S. elections. There's a debate next month. There's the conventions in the summer. There's the election itself. Unfortunately, we will be covering all of that, starting with the reality show in a couple of minutes. Thanks, Daniel. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and we'll see you in a couple of minutes.